Sporting the single highest Metacritic rating for a game ever, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was quite a way to end 1998. For years, studios had been trying different ideas like open worlds and immersion in Ultima, action adventures with Crash Bandicoot, or a deeper focus on storytelling like in Half-Life. But for Nintendo, Ocarina of Time was not just about to be another great hit, but potentially one of the single most important and influential pieces of media ever. For the first time in the IP's history, Link was going into the realm of the 3D, and during this transition, bringing with him so much innovation and quality. First of all, Ocarina of Time is simply one of the most beloved games ever made. It contains a sweeping and emotional story, time travel along with game mechanics centered around it, and a lush and living world that beckons the player to explore more. For example, in one dungeon later in the story, you must travel back in time to plant seeds of things that your future self can use 10 years later in order to solve puzzles. In other locations, by carefully studying the environment, you can unlock clues to secrets and lore that most players would otherwise miss. Things like this are what made Ocarina so special for its time, and when you combine that with a breathtaking musical score and a dynamic world, it's immediately obvious why this game was so influential. Because you have to remember, while nowadays the title looks and feels archaic in many ways, during its release, it was a full-on revolution. Things like lock-on targeting for foes in 3D games was popularized here in Ocarina of Time. It was also one of the first games to claim to have a night and day cycle with a genuinely believable open world that allowed you to tackle missions and story beats in whatever way you saw fit. Things like this seem so obvious and commonplace in open world games now, but it's titles like Ocarina that really started the revolution, proving just how immersive, expansive, and amazing games of this nature could be. Another perfect instance of this was how this Zelda title also popularized context-sensitive inputs. Before, most games would try to map every single button to a single action, vastly limiting inputs without macros and reducing scope. But in Ocarina of Time, everything just felt fluid. Calling upon your horse and gliding across an open field while jumping around or engaging in endless combat and puzzles never got old, and many of the same buttons could be used for different things, and it felt natural. And the story to this day is many players' favorite in the series, introducing concepts that went on to define the genre even in its first 3D go-around. And honestly, a list like this wouldn't be complete without The Legend of Zelda, one of the most important game franchises ever that seems to pump out one legendary fix after another. And also, the fact that so many fantastic games came out in just 1 year is still amazing. It goes to show that even just a decade after such low lows of the video game crash of 1983, you can wind up in a situation where there is too much good to go around. The dawn of the 90s was an interesting time for gamers. In many ways, it's a decade that really formed the video game industry as we know it now, and resulted in many of the most influential titles of all time. And what better place to start than 1993, with the release of the original Doom. While other first-person shooters had already existed up to this point, most of them were very basic, arcade-focused, and straightforward, finding a home on consoles and arcades with basic mechanics and layouts. But for id Software, a small Texas-based company, they wanted more, and they were about to get it. Led by a team under John Romero and famous genius programmer John Carmack, they set out to revolutionize the FPS genre and games as a whole. Built from the ground up for Windows PCs, Doom was an amalgamation of technical innovation, addictive gameplay, and community engagement. The title included intricate 3D graphics and level designs the likes of which the world had never seen before. Home to verticality and shooting galleries that left behind the arcade staples of old for more familiar, non-orthogonal rooms. Each level had varied heights, colors, sounds, and guns to pick up that all felt weighty and powerful. As you raced around levels at breakneck speed shooting demons, blood would cover the entire screen and walls while the wails of demon NPCs let loose. It was an absolutely visceral experience for the time, on the cutting edge of technology that threw away antiquated conventions from before that limited scope and ambition. On top of this too, Doom included 3 key features that set it apart from other games of the time, that massively have affected the industry even to this day. First of all, Doom included networked multiplayer and so-called deathmatch modes. Long before online multiplayer was commonplace, Doom allowed friends to all connect their PCs in a local area network and battle one another, resulting in some of the first LAN parties where dozens of people would come together to compete and have fun in person. Secondly, Doom also gave users access to what were called WAD packages. Short for Where's All My Data, these files were designed in a modular way that gave players the power to create their own levels and mods, which only further fostered a thriving community of players that could not only come together and battle on the same map, but could battle on their very own as well. And finally, maybe the most forgotten key feature of Doom that made it so influential was its shareware distribution. You see, while most of the titles of the era were locked behind a paywall in order to play, the very first level of Doom, known as Knee Deep in the Dead, was entirely free to download, no questions asked. This one simple design decision, which nowadays seems commonplace in the games industry with free-to-play, might just be the main reason Doom got so big. During its initial distribution at the University of Wisconsin, for example, the entire campus's network crashed under the load. Some reporters even have noted that by 1995, just 2 years after Doom's initial release, there were more computers on Earth with Doom installed than even Windows 95. Single-handedly, Doom lit a fire under the chairs of PC gamers and massively advanced not only the FPS genre, but games and 3D technology as a whole. id Software even lent out the engine to other developers of the time to make their own games too, which led to a flood of new impressive FPS titles on the market just years later. But you see, all of this success didn't come without controversy too, as famously at the time it was taboo to even talk about playing Doom. And that's because during the early 1980s up until the mid-90s, America had been in a constant state of fear of demons and the ritualistic, owing to a string of conspiracy theories, some now proven true, about satanic cults and worship that were taking over the youth. This satanic panic, as it was called, meant anything showing demons or killing was met with extreme backlash from parents. And as you can guess, Doom was a perfect target. With games like it and Mortal Kombat also releasing around the same time, parents were arguing on national television about how video games were destroying the youth and why they should be banned. And Doom from 1993 is really the first big example of the anti-video game sentiment that would sweep the nation at other points in the coming years as well. And really all that is to say that the original Doom is without a doubt one of the most impactful games of all time. It revolutionized gaming engines and technology overnight, showed how much more complex level design could be, incorporated community elements in genius ways that showed the power of building a community around a game, and sparked controversies that hit the mainstream media and caused alarm across an entire nation. It was the perfect storm at the perfect time, one that even to this day has had obvious effects on the games industry and where it is now. After the success of Pong in 1972, the next set of arcade classics revolved around two main topics: sports and spaceships. Classics like Atari Football, Indy 800, Mattel Auto Race, and most prominent of all by far, Space Invaders. These classics of the late 70s and early 80s eras saw hordes of young men flocking to arcades to try and get the next high score shooting aliens or scoring goals. But as instrumental as these titles were, there was something else right on the horizon that would prove to be even more impactful. A title that would genuinely push the medium of video games forward. Pac Man. Originally conceptualized by a game designer at Atari named Toru Iwatani, this seemingly innocuous game had an astounding 17-month development time with 9 full-time developers working every day on it, much longer than the average of the era with a fairly sizable team. But this tireless work would soon prove worthwhile, as something huge was about to happen. You see, the original pitch for Pac Man was about making something different. During the late 70s, almost every arcade game was heavily marketed towards young male audiences. But Atari saw potential in hitting a new market, one that was less hardcore and more focused on just family fun. Based around the idea of food, something that all people love, Pac Man himself was nothing more than a pizza with a slice cut out who would run around the map eating to his heart's desire. It was the perfect setup to attract a new crowd of people. However, the initial release and location testing in Japan in May of 1980 led to mixed reviews and reception, with many casual first-time arcade goers loving it, but veteran Space Invader aficionados scoffing at the simple premise. And yet, despite the naysayers, throughout the first year on the market, Pac Man quickly began to gain popularity, even dethroning Space Invaders on the charts as the most popular arcade game in Japan. This quick success led to a North American release via Midway Games in October of 1980, and this is where things truly changed. Overnight, Pac Man started to top every single arcade chart across the country, appealing to a wide array of new audiences, including women, children, and men alike who could all find joy in the new casual experience. In America, arcades started ordering entire rows of Pac Man machines to replace entire inventories with, which resulted in over $8 million in revenue per week in just the US alone. Within a year, over 100,000 Pac Man cabinets had been sold, gobbling up $1 billion in quarters by the end of 1981. Whereas Pong was a breakout success story that put video games on the map, Pac Man was launching the medium into a whole new realm. One where women, children, men, and families could all enjoy together, Atari's goal from its initial inception. And it can't be overstated just how impactful the release and success of Pac Man really was. It showed not only how big the video game industry could get, birthing hundreds of new companies dedicated to making games in the process, but it also gave us the first big indication of how important branding and design is in games. Unlike most titles of the time that were nothing more than spaceships or small human sprites, Pac Man was an almost Disney or Pixar-like character. A larger-than-life piece of food or puck which had a smile on its face as it dashed around the map. Even the ghosts which Pac Man can eat or be chased by were given names by the community with their own colors and expressions. And while these things seem small, they're one of the main reasons that development took so long, but it's also likely what propelled this title to such great heights. Pac Man was a game that, yes, like others, was about getting the high score, but it also was developed as an experience too. Merchandising for the arcade game reportedly sold millions as well, with many players becoming attached to the character, wanting to see them in movies and shows at the time. These lessons, even to this day, still have an effect on the games industry, where strong characters and design are now a staple and focus of almost every AAA game out there. It showed that games weren't just for a subset of geeks who like hitting arcades on the weekend, but rather could be a stomping ground for a much bigger entertainment medium, the likes of movies and television. And little did we know that in just a couple more decades, it would be eclipsing both. The 90s in many ways were a period of what are now affectionately called boomer shooters. Fast-paced, high-action, and bloody shooting galleries that all took a page out of the Doom playbook and tried to focus purely on bombastic gameplay and speed. But for Valve, a fairly new startup made of ex-Microsoft developers, their vision for the FPS genre was about to change the video game medium forever. Released on November 19th of 1998, Half-Life was built from the ground up as an evolution of not just first-person shooters, but games in general. By licensing out id Software's Quake engine and bootstrapping their own tech on top, Valve's aim was to make an FPS that focused more on immersion and story, the world building, than any before. And well, they succeeded in ways that put even games nowadays to shame. First of all, Half-Life was one of the very first video games, along with things like Ultima Underworld, that actually felt immersive, like a living, breathing world. Not only had Valve hired famed science fiction writer Mark Laidlaw to construct the story, but throughout the adventure, unlike most other games, there was barely any cutscene. Famously, for example, at the start of the adventure, the player can walk around in a fast-moving tram as it coasts across the desert and into a top-secret Black Mesa facility, allowing you to just simply take in the sights and sounds around you as it goes. Every other game of the time period and before would have made a sequence like this purely a cutscene where the camera panned from one angle to another. But Half-Life made the genius decision to, as much as possible, keep control in the player's hands. This philosophy too carried over to gameplay and moment-to-moment action. where entire levels allowed for exploration and puzzles, along with ways to discover more lore about the universe. This wasn't just another shooting gallery full of enemies that made grunting noises. This was a living, breathing world with history, politics, and a story about the most significant discovery in human history. For the first time in the chronicle of video games, a truly immersive experience built from the ground up to envelop the player was here. It was first person, it was visceral, and it was engaging. And as if it couldn't get any more innovative for the time, so many other aspects of the title were groundbreaking too. NPCs would realistically react to things you did, enemy AI was so advanced that most modern games don't even have the same level of intelligence, wherein Half-Life enemies will flank, strategize, and flush you out of cover. And the physics engine was state-of-the-art, allowing players to feel more attached to the world in every moment. In fact, in Half-Life 2, the beloved sequel, which released in 2004, all of these aspects were vastly improved upon too, with additions of things like the gravity gun, which took Valve's technological prowess to the next level. But still, while nowadays most people look back on Half-Life 2 most fondly, it's Half-Life 1 that was really the grand innovator and influencer in the industry. A game that showed the world that first-person shooters and games in general could be more than just fun simulators. They could tell stories, not ones just for kids like Super Mario, but ones that made you think, worlds that appeared genuine, and lore that begged players to look deeper and deeper. The title even included multiple visceral horror elements full of suspense, along with extended sections of walking where there was nothing more to do than simply take in the immersive environment around you. And that's not even to mention all of the other innovations Half-Life brought to the table. For instance, Valve took the modding scene to the next level when they decided to release the entire engine and toolset they used to make the game to the public. What seemed like an insane move at the time turned out to be genius, as modders flocked to Half-Life and began making tens of thousands of mods that became ultra popular. Even games like Counter-Strike were originally mods using the Half-Life engine, and Valve would later go on to buy out entire mod teams and have them work on games in-house, many of which have gone on to become some of the most played games in human history. And also, with Half-Life and its modding scene's enormous success, it gave Valve the capital they needed to start Steam 5 years later, the de facto marketplace for PC games that makes tens of billions of dollars in revenue a year. Or in other words, Half-Life was not only a revolution for its time, the start of a focus on immersive titles, my personal favorite type of video game, shout out Prey and Cyberpunk, but it also gave rise to maybe the single most important video game company in history as well. Its cultural impact can never be overstated, and its importance in where the industry is nowadays is palpable. As the 1980s carried on, arcade games were becoming more and more popular, and the growth of home consoles was starting to flourish. But by 1983, this fast growth finally came to a head, resulting in the biggest crash the video games industry has ever seen. At the time, it felt like every single game was a soulless carbon copy of one another, churned out by studios looking for nothing more than a quick buck, with barely any innovation or passion showing through. Consumers were quickly losing faith in the entire industry and growing bored playing the same arcade-style games over and over again. For any of you who say games are too expensive or bad nowadays, know that the early 80s was a nightmare. And what we have now is a paradise in comparison. I've said it before and I'll say it again, the current period we're at in video games, if you actually study history, is the best it's ever been by far, and saying otherwise is probably just being blinded by nostalgia. Regardless of my personal opinions though, the North American market, especially during this period, was being hit hard, and something needed to come along to save the video games medium as we know it. But luckily for us, that something was right around the corner. Super Mario Bros. In 1985, in the throes of the industry's downturn, Nintendo was planning on the release of their newest home console, the NES, in North American markets. And to accompany the release of this new tech, they needed a killer app, a game that would practically force people to go out and buy. Technically speaking, there was a previous arcade hit called Mario Bros, but Super Mario Bros. Wasn't aiming to be like its predecessor. Rather, it was shooting for the stars. aiming to craft an entirely new type of experience the world had never seen before. You see, at the time, almost every video game had a strict focus on high scores and shooting things on screen, with the only reason to play being besting your friends and seeing how well you could do. But Super Mario Bros. Was going to be different. Rather than a focus on competition, the game was going to be all about the adventure. Across a suite of 32 levels, players got to gallivant around the Mushroom Kingdom, taking on Goombas they would jump on top of, bosses with intricate mechanics, and secrets to uncover hidden away. For the first time, built from the ground up as a family experience just like Pac Man, gamers were treated to the first commercially, truly mainstream action-adventure title. In a world of endless dark alien shootouts and arcade cabinets, everything was about to change. Overnight, Super Mario Bros. Became a roaring success, selling out NES consoles across America and leading to every single child with a pulse begging their parents for a chance to play. By the end of this run, the title had sold over 40 million copies, which even nowadays is a monumental feat, and at the time meant it wouldn't be matched for decades. Super Mario Bros. Was a hit unlike anything the world had ever seen, a game that not only showed just how much bigger the video game industry could be than what Pac Man revealed, but proved that it could be just as mainstream as movies, music, or television too. But outside of just the financial success and accolades of Nintendo's Big Gambit, Super Mario Bros. Also revolutionized game design and principles too, affecting titles we play even to this day. First of all, Super Mario placed a big emphasis on the characters and mascots, including Mario himself, the princess, or even Bowser. These were NPCs that people grew attached to and loved, especially because of the distinct worlds filled with pits, pipes, and enemies, along with striking colors and an unforgettable soundtrack that is now one of the most recognizable in the world. Countless other innovations were made here too, like making the first level of the game a pseudo-tutorial that felt fun to play while teaching players basic mechanics. Even games nowadays do this constantly, which all started here. And really, it can't be overstated just how much of a revolution and evolution this title was at the time. It really just had everything. A huge suite of levels that were all vast and allowed you to explore from side to side. And another big innovation, power-ups that let Mario do things like grow larger or throw deadly fireballs. The entire ethos of the game really was a move away from the arcade romps of old and into something much more interesting. The beginnings of video games that focused on adventure, new types of goals, and not just standing in front of a cabinet. A focus on fun adventure, characters you would remember, songs you could hum to, and a story that filled your heart with joy. In a way, Super Mario Bros. Was the birth of video games as we actually know them today. And after its unimaginable success in 1985 and 86, it felt like every other video game company out there was focused on making adventure titles the next big step in the industry. Entire franchises like Sonic the Hedgehog owe their success to the pavement that Mario laid. And outside of just its genre, Super Mario Bros. Is also credited as single-handedly saving the industry from the Great Recession it experienced starting in 1983. Because with Super Mario Bros., it became immediately clear to everyone that games could be more than just high-score competitions or meaningless shooting galleries. Games could tell stories, could craft worlds, and take us on adventures of a lifetime, the likes of which the whole family could get behind and love. In any great story, there is always a beginning. And in the story of video games and their rise to prominence, this beginning comes from none other than Pong. You see, long before 1972, Pong's original release date, arcades had been a staple of American city life for over a decade. But up until this point, almost everything you would find in an arcade consisted of mechanical games like pinball or skee-ball, popular staples even to this day. More traditional video game arcades as we know them now were still a novelty, but all of that was about to change with the release of the first commercially successful game of all time. The story goes like this. A newly hired engineer named Alan Alcorn was picked up by the Silicon Valley startup Atari, and his boss Nolan Bushnell's first order of business was to see if Alan could program a simple ping-pong game to prove his worth. With nothing more than a $75 Hitachi black and white TV set as a display, Alan concocted a minimal approach, with a blank white ball moving between two rectangular paddles on the side, constantly increasing in speed as the game went on. Without a doubt, you've all probably seen or played Pong at least once in your life before, except maybe the Zoomers. But regardless, during these early days, Atari was unsure how the product would even do, with many things being hacked together last second. For example, the original game got all of its sound effects from repurposed television sync signals that fired off mid-gameplay. This wasn't a big budget experiment or product, it was a quick prototype game created on a whim. But ironically, that speed and creation would also carry over to its journey into the mainstream as well. The first Pong arcade cabinet was installed at Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale, California in November of 1972. And within just a month, it had become an overnight sensation. Pong machines started to pop up all over the surrounding area, raking in over $40 a day in profits on average, 3 to 5 times the typical earnings of a pinball machine in the era. And as with all things in life, once money gets involved, everything changes. By 1973, Atari had produced over 7,000 Pong machines, generating $3 million in annual sales, rocketing Atari's valuation to over $250 million, the equivalent of $1.2 billion in today's dollars. And that success not only allowed Atari to grow into a tech powerhouse of the late 70s, but it also spawned the creation of countless new arcade video games from both Atari and rising competitors. In fact, by the end of 1974, over 15 major US and Japanese companies were developing arcade game video games full-time, which years later would lead into what many know as the golden age of arcades, 1978 through 83. And really, the success of Pong cannot be understated for just how much of an effect it had on the industry. And while some small-scale games had been created and distributed before, none were even close to the level of widespread appeal of Pong. For the first time ever, a video game was hitting the mainstream, and families and friends across America were flocking to arcades to try out the beginning of a movement. And almost ironically, a lot of Pong's success can be owed to just how simple it is. Anyone watching or playing the game can immediately pick up on how it works. It's as easy as moving your paddle across the screen up and down to try and hit a ball as the speed increases, with the ultimate goal of moving the ball across the opponent's side of the screen before they can catch it. Think about it like a zoomed-in soccer match where the two goals are right next to each other and the goalies keep hitting the ball back and forth. It's the type of experience that nowadays would be laughably basic if it were to come out, but it's that simplicity that was needed for early revolutions, bringing in the masses to a new type of entertainment medium. And even to this day, Pong is widely celebrated by many as one of the greatest and most culturally significant video games of all time. Because in a way, it spawned the video game medium in the first place. Without Pong, we wouldn't have had future arcade classics like Space Invaders, or the rise and fall of Atari, and later focus on home consoles and personal computers for gaming. It's the type of game that is immediately recognizable, easy to understand, and most importantly, just fun. And it's crazy to think that Pong is now over 50 years old. The original game that kicked it all off, and one that led the charge into every other title we will be talking about of the most influential of all time. Throughout the 90s, countless notable titles were released. Things like System Shock and Donkey Kong Country in '94, Chrono Trigger in '95, and Final Fantasy VII and Ultima Online in '97. But it was the following year, 1998, where things really started to get crazy. And the first game we need to look at in this period is none other than Blizzard Entertainment's Starcraft. Initially released at the tail end of March, the latest RTS, or real-time strategy from the industry's PC juggernaut, was impactful in ways no other game in the genre had been previously. While standouts like Age of Empires, Dune 2, Command & Conquer, or Red Alert had all garnered strong audiences giving rise to the golden age of RTS, it was StarCraft that was going to light the scene on fire. Just a few years previously, Blizzard Entertainment had released Warcraft 2, another popular RTS for the PC platform. But with StarCraft, they wanted to do something darker, grittier, more technologically impressive, all with a science fiction touch. While most RTS games at the time were very symmetrical and balanced, meaning each player was given a similar set of units across factions to play with that mined for resources and built armies to wage wars, Starcraft was a little different. While certainly not the first fully asymmetrical RTS game, it was without a doubt the most popular. Players were given the chance to choose between 3 separate races, Zerg, Protoss, or Terran, each with their own fully unique units, economies, playstyles, and design. A Zerg player, for instance, had to rely on making large swaths of forces quickly that would die easily but could overwhelm opponents in pure numbers, while Protoss combatants built only a few select units that, using their shields, could take on entire platoons. This focus on variety and uniqueness across each race really added to the fun factor of the experience and allowed for fascinating and devastating combinations or strategies that gave birth to so many insane moments. The skill level in Starcraft was unlike any game before it, and even to this day, I would argue that Starcraft is without a doubt the hardest game ever made. Not only because of how difficult it is to control entire armies with small selection groups, all while growing your forces back home and building, but because Starcraft was also the birthplace of modern-day esports. You see, while the original release of Starcraft is still regarded by many as one of the most legendary game releases ever, its later DLC, Brood War, which released in December of '98, is what propelled this title into truly legendary status. Brood War not only added lots of new units and strategies for each race in the game, but also really dialed in on the competitive aspect, forcing in some much-needed balance changes and updates that took the game from fun but wonky to competitively perfect. And also, this was during a time period too when constant patching and changes weren't happening in online games, meaning the product that Blizzard shipped with Brood War had to be fairly perfect from the get-go, and well, it was. Even decades later, this DLC is being played in competitions for thousands of dollars, giving rise to many of the most respected and coveted esports players in the world. And speaking of esports, it's what makes Starcraft one of the most influential games of all time. And the best example of this is during the release of Brood War specifically, South Korea was undergoing a massive technological boom with affordable high-speed internet taking hold for the masses and PC cafes opening up across every other block. In each of these cafes, far and away the most popular game to play was Starcraft. And as more and more copies were sold, a budding scene of young amateurs were dedicating every waking moment of their lives to going to these PC cafes and practicing, trying to become the best amongst their friends. Quickly, this excitement flooded into the mainstream, with elite StarCraft players forming teams that went to be broadcasted on national television playing, taking StarCraft from just a fun game to an entire nation's pastime. It was here, in South Korea, under the guidance of StarCraft and Brood War, that esports as we know them today were born. And this culture in South Korea in time led to growth in the United States, China, Europe, Russia, and South America for other massive titles too in the future, like Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Overwatch, and what surely will be many more to come. Whereas nowadays tons of titles have million-dollar tournaments with young men and women getting rich, it was StarCraft that started it all. And to this day, it's still the hardest esport ever made with the highest skill ceiling. A title that in many ways will never be topped. And that's not even to mention the fact that the custom games and StarCraft Online lobbies were so influential as well. Entire genres like MOBAs were first birthed in custom game lobbies in StarCraft where people would design their own maps, layouts, and rules that anyone could play with friends. I even know about this one firsthand, as originally what got me into video games was my dad, who loved playing StarCraft with me when I was young. And I can't tell you how many hours I spent on the weekend as a young child designing new maps in the editor for us to play. It's a big part of the reason I eventually became a software engineer now as well, and I'm sure a lot of you have similar stories. And really, StarCraft was just a title that is so much more impactful and important than people could have ever have guessed at the time of its release. A game that not only was a technological and gameplay marvel for its time, but changed the entire course of history for the game's medium as we know it with the rise of esports and entire new genres.